Hello, I'm Joel Woodruff, president of the C.S. Lewis Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this special CSLI virtual event titled Eric Liddell, From Gold Medalist to God's Missionary. For some of us older folks, the Scotsman by the name of Eric Liddell became a household name in the 1980s following the release of the Academy Award-winning film Chariots of Fire. Eric's story of winning the gold medal at the 1924 Paris Olympics, as retold in this movie, inspired a generation of athletes. It encouraged them to not only pursue their dreams through sacrifice, perseverance, and the enjoyment of their God-given gifts, but also demonstrated the impact a person can make when they're not willing to compromise their beliefs, even in the midst of great adversity. It also has one of the greatest, I suppose, movie quotes that Eric Liddell actually didn't say, but I think many people have felt represented his life when he said, "When I run, I feel his pleasure." Eric, when everything he did, sensed God's presence in his life. Fortunately, the story of Eric Liddell is being remembered again through the work of the Eric Liddell community based in Edinburgh, Scotland, where Eric studied as a university student. They're recognizing and celebrating the life, sporting, and community service achievements of one of Scotland's iconic figures in the centenary years following his Olympic gold medal win in 1924 and his launch into missionary service in 1925 to China. Last year, they celebrated Liddell's amazing win in the 400-meter race in the 1924 Olympics, an event which he wasn't even slated to run. For as many of you know, he was supposed to run the 100-meter race as the odds-winning favorite. However, the Olympic Committee scheduled the 100-meter race on a Sunday, the Lord's Day, or Sabbath, a day in which Eric had promised God he would not compete or work. Despite great public and private pressure on him to run for the United Kingdom, including vitriolic words written and spoken against him in the press, he held his ground and would not bend on his promise to God not to compete on a Sunday. As a result, he was disqualified from the 100, and another British runner was given the opportunity to run the 100-meter race. In God's providence, however, another runner who knew of Liddell's predicament encouraged the British Olympic Committee to put Eric in the 400-meter race, a much longer and more difficult one. Eric took that opportunity to not only represent his country, but to represent God by giving it his all and winning the race. Let's take a moment to watch that historic 400-meter race of Eric at the 1924 Paris Olympics. At the time, this win by Eric Liddell took the world by storm, and the story continues to live on. I encourage any of you who haven't yet seen the Oscar-winning film Chariots of Fire to do so. You may even find yourself starting to run to the unforgettable musical score of the movie, written by the Greek electronic composer Vangelis. If Eric's story had stopped after the Olympics, it still would have been a good story. However, Eric's life was becoming even more inspirational and grow in depth. Only 1 year after becoming a household name throughout the world, he gave up the limelight and fame to follow his God-given call to missionary work in China. During the next 2 decades of his life, Eric courageously shared his faith in Jesus Christ with the people of China, once again demonstrating faithfulness, sacrifice, and commitment to his Lord as he discipled others. This June of 2025 is the centenary anniversary of Eric leaving for missionary service in China. and is also being celebrated by the Eric Liddell 100 community, both in the United Kingdom and the United States. Let's now hear from Bob Rendell, former CEO of the Eric Liddell Center in Edinburgh, Scotland. Bob, thanks so much for joining us as we reflect upon the life of Eric Liddell.
It's a pleasure.
Well, obviously the center is named after Eric Liddell, and I know that many people know about Eric's story, the one told in the movie where he wouldn't compete on Sundays in his best event, the 100 meters, wins the gold medal in the 400 meter race and becomes a national hero. But many people don't really know kind of the rest of the story after he really left fortune and fame, you might say, to go into mission work in China. And I imagine there had to be a particular motivation behind that. Can you tell us a little bit what you know about Eric's faith in Jesus Christ and how that impacted his decision really to live the kind of life he did?
Eric always wanted to return to China. In fact, I've got a note here where one of his responses to people, if he was asked about going back to China and not running in, say, the 1928 Olympics, he would say quite clearly, "I believe God made me for China." He would, in the year prior to going over to China, he would do a lot of preparatory work that would provide him with a depth of background and skills that would come in extremely handy in China. For instance, one of the first things that he did was sign a contract with the London Missionary Society to go to teach at the Anglo-Chinese College in Tientsin. In order to back that up, he signed up for a theological course which he would complete over a year in the Scottish Congregational College in Edinburgh. In addition to that, he had a very close friend called D.P. Thompson, who was brilliant at advertising Eric's presence at sporting events and the evangelistic events that would happen afterwards. So Eric found himself in that year preparing for going to China by evangelizing in very small groups or to very large crowds of people. At one point, very near to the point when he was ready to go off to China, he was invited to speak at the Usher Hall in Edinburgh. And folks thought, well, he's not really going to draw a crowd to fill the Usher Hall. But as it happened, he not only filled the Usher Hall, but he filled a range of ancillary halls around about it. Over the years, I've had the privilege of meeting people, very elderly people, who were participants in those events and who responded to God's call to ministry as a direct result of Eric Liddell's ministry in those events. So what we have is a young man who continues to love his sporting life, who is involved in evangelism, and who is doing extra studies to prepare him for life as a missionary in China. And well, I think as a person, it helped him to develop that wholeness and that roundedness as a person, which would sustain him, of course, based in what proved to be a wonderful prayer life and in his biblical studies.
Well, I imagine he must have had a very strong call to China from God, because it sounds like, you know, he was having these amazing evangelistic meetings. People were responding to his events. So I'm sure there must have been, as part of him, that wondered, should I stay in Scotland for a little while longer or continue? But why do you think he ended up, pushing into China even after that things were going so well there in Scotland?
I think the answer to that is found in that statement that he believed that God had created him for China. That was his purpose in life, and whatever calling he fulfilled as part of that purpose would always involve China. And I think that's important for people to recognize. Here was a man who knew from very early on, this is what God wants me to do, and however I do it is in God's hands. He could have accepted a whole range of different offers in relation to his Olympic fame, but he didn't. He turned his back on that because he knew that there was something greater for him to do. Although I think probably with quite a bit of humility, because he wasn't a kind of showy type of person.
Well, so Eric leaves the fame and also just the invitations in Scotland and in Europe to go to China. And so tell us a little bit about what his roles were there in China. What did he do once he got there?
Well, he was a teacher, and as soon as he arrived, he spent time with his family in Pai de Ho. He hadn't seen some of the family for many, many years, so that was a lovely catch-up time before the beginning of the school term. And he was employed there as a missionary teacher of sport and science. What a lovely combination for him. And in addition to that, he would participate in Bible studies. These would be Bible studies that were in the school, because part of the work there was to draw young men into the faith through the relationships that were built within the school. In addition to that, he became Sunday school superintendent at the Union Church, and was involved in a whole range of other aspects. He continued his training in sports, and he would give the pupils leads. Or he would take a handicap, that's maybe a better way of putting it, but would still win. And I'm sure I read a letter that he wrote where he describes trying to convince these young Chinese men to divest themselves of the robes so that they could play rugby properly. So you can imagine it would be a lot of fun. And he was a guy with a tremendous amount of humor, and that came through in his teaching. But he participated in the wider community in China as well.
And so it sounds like he was obviously very engaged there in living out his faith through teaching, through sports, and through the school, and reaching out to the Chinese community as well as the international community there. My understanding is as well that it's in China then that he and his wife got their family started. Can you tell us about his family life and marriage and children?
Well, Florence's parents were Canadian missionaries, and they returned to China in 1926, and that's when Eric would have met her. At that point, she was a 14-year-old girl, and of course, I don't suppose he would have paid that much attention to her at that point. But eventually, she became the church organist and pianist. He was the Sunday school superintendent. She was teaching in Sunday school. She was also receiving piano lessons from Jenny, Eric's sister. And as she grew and developed, he began to notice her more, and the relationship developed. I love the phrase of it developing over tea and tennis. Always chaperoned. They were very, very careful about the relationship. And I don't know that Florence was really aware of how he felt about her until after he spoke to her about getting married, and that would be about 1929. Getting married, or the thought of getting married in 1929, became married in 1934,
Wow.
because Florence, I was away to use my daughter's name there, Florence had to return to Canada, where she was going to be doing a nursing training. And it was agreed that there would be no marriage until after she had completed her nursing training. And that was completed in 1934.
And so then they served together then in China, and then at that time, when did their children start coming?
Well, I had to take a note of this. Patricia's actually 80 this year, believe it or not, in July. Heather was born in 1935. Patricia will be 90 this year. Heather was born in 37, and Maureen, who Eric would never hold or even see a photograph of, was born in 1941. They never had the opportunity to work together. Eric was teaching, and Florence would have been running the home. And Florence did want to go with him when he moved from a calling to teach to a calling to work from the mission station at St. John, where he had spent his childhood and where his brother was the doctor. The London Missionary Society had different ideas, and I just love the story of this qualified nurse kicking suitcases around to get rid of her anger at their decision, because of course she would have been wonderful as a support at the mission station with her nursing qualifications and an ama to look after the children.
So it sounds like then the Mission Society sent Eric over to the school, and then Florence had to be and the children in a separate location in China, though, as well, just in different parts.
While he was teaching in the school, they were able to live together. But when he was posted to Saichung, she wasn't allowed to go.
And then, so how long were they apart during that time period?
That would be maybe 3 or 4 years. When Eric was moving back and forward. If the mission station needed supplies or needed money, Eric would go back to Tianjin to get it. And Florence came up with the idea of scooping out the interior of French sticks and putting the money, Chinese money, not Japanese money, into the French stick so that Eric could smuggle it through. So they were seeing one another, but for very short periods of time, if he was able to come back. And then, of course, they had furloughs together. But in reality, for a young married couple, they didn't spend the amount of time together that they would have loved to spend together.
So they're in China, and it's around that time then that the Japanese invasion begins. Can you tell us about what happened there with the Japanese coming into China, and what happened to the missionaries and to their work there?
To put all of that into context, when Eric arrived in China, banditry and so on were all part and parcel for life there. A lot of control was in the hands of warlords. And then there was the battling between the nationalists and the communists. All of that was happening before the Japanese invaded. The local people, they hated their foreign overlords. And so life was pretty difficult and pretty dangerous. And one of Eric's school colleagues, somebody who actually he was attending Chinese classes with, Eric Scarlett, he was shot by accident in a robbery by bandits. So there was never an easy time for Eric or any of the missionaries during that time frame. Japan's Kwantung Army invaded in September 1931, and they took control of Manchuria. And over the years after that, they continued to expand their presence there. So that by the time Eric and his brother Rob are traveling from Tientsin out to Saichong, they are actually having to cross Japanese war lines. Mm-hmm. And that made life very, very, very difficult.
I imagine. It sounds like maybe one of the reasons that the mission organization didn't have the wife Florence go with him, it was a dangerous territory he was crossing, it sounds, with the bandits and then the Japanese invasion. And it sounds like it was a very tense time, it sounds like, in that period of history. My understanding is in that eventually got to the point where Eric felt it just wasn't safe even for his family to be there. And can you tell us what kind of decisions did he and his wife have to make?
Well, they had to work through the fact that they would be separated. Eric really didn't want to be separated from Florence again for any length of time, and he certainly didn't want to be separated from the girls. Florence had obviously told Eric that she was expecting another baby, and Maureen would eventually be born in September of 41. So all of the focus of their thinking was around what was important for the children. How can we keep the children safe? How can we protect them? And eventually they came to the decision that Florence and the children would move over to Canada, to the safety over there. Florence stated quite clearly that I wouldn't have gone if it wasn't for the children. So we've got a very feisty woman here.
You do. Yeah.
And her daughter's not unlike her.
Yes. Sounds like they were a good match there, the Eric and Florence, and their. Yeah. So it sounds like Florence and the children then departed for Canada, but Eric stayed on at the time. Why didn't he go with them at the time? What was kind of the thinking behind that?
Florence said that she was very, very clear that Eric would never negate his contract with the London Missionary Society, but importantly, she knew that he would never leave his people, the Chinese people. That's how he saw the Chinese people. It must have been a really distressing decision for them to make, and quite a heartbreaking one, to have to walk away from one another in that way.
I'm sure. And so Florence and the children go to Canada, Eric's in China, and then my understanding is that the Japanese ended up coming into the school. And what happened at that point? Where did they take Eric and the students and the other teachers?
Well, Eric and by that time, Eric and other missionaries were all living in the concession. They were kind of under house guard there and had been for a couple of years. Eric had continued to minister in the best way that he could. He was delivering mail within the French and British concessions where missionaries lived, and he was writing sermon notes because there was prohibition on gatherings of more than 10 people. So small house groups were set up, and Eric provided sermon material for those groups. And he also started working on his book, The Disciplines of the Christian Life, which, as you know, was published posthumously. Eventually, all received notification that they were going to Weisheng, and they had to prepare and pack for that. They had to send a mattress ahead and so on. Of course, they had no idea what they were going to.
And so they end up in a Japanese internment camp, and with students, with teachers, all kinds of people. When Eric got there, what kind of roles then did Eric play in this very difficult internment camp, which they're now really almost, they're not considered prisoners of war, but really they're in that kind of situation in a internment camp, can't leave, and have an occupying force surrounding them?
Well, there were a range of different activities that were organized. As you can imagine, it wasn't a pristine camp. It wasn't like going to a holiday camp where everything is laid on, and the school itself, which I believe had been an American Baptist school and had been beautifully kept, had been ransacked by that time. And let me just read some of the stuff here that was wrong. Plaster had been stripped from the former school walls, pipework and radiators ripped out, no running water or heating, windows broken, furniture had been destroyed, some beyond repair. Latrines had been vandalized, wells had been filled, very little in the way of lighting. So groups were set up to lead and sort out all of this, and to ensure the smooth running of a community of 1,800 people, which eventually would be joined by pupils from Shifu. So to answer your questions, Eric was the designated math and science teacher, and the Eric Liddell community proudly displays a handwritten and hand-drawn chemistry experiment jotter that Eric created for one of the pupils. It's quite something to see. I saw it when it was on display at the Scottish Parliament. Quite an amazing piece of work, because of course, as pupils, they couldn't do the experiments themselves. So he explained in pencil form how they could be done. Oh, in addition to that, he organized church worship. He organized Bible classes and scripture readings. He was invited to preach in many of the various denominations. Eric organized sports, repaired sports equipment, took extra turns in pumping water. He cleaned latrines. He chopped wood. He rolled coal balls that he then delivered to many of the elderly people in the camp. He disposed of garbage. He swept paths. He carried the occasional delivery of Red Cross parcels, and so on. In addition to all of that, he was in great demand among the young folk. He was a listening ear to all of them, and a counsellor to those who knew him as Uncle Eric. And apparently a sign had to be put up on the door of the rooms that he shared, saying that Uncle Eric in or out. And when he was out, people knew not to hammer on the door because he wasn't there. He'd be called upon to adjudicate in disputes, because everyone held him in such high regard and trusted him. He was someone who could be trusted to make the right kind of decision. He wholeheartedly supported Father Scanlon in his smuggling activities, quietly delivering eggs and other foodstuffs that had been smuggled into the camp. And of course, eggshells would be ground down and would go into food for younger people to help build up calcium in the bones. Through all of this, he was invited to meetings across all social divides, and he took his turn helping with youth activities, including games, sports events. He refereed on a Sunday when he realised that young lives were endangered by unruly behaviour, is what I've written down here. I think it was a wee bit more than that. Eric also provided teenagers and young men with training on makeshift running tracks. And he participated in the sports events. They would have sports days, and he would participate. And he won in all of them, apart from one, while he was ill, when a young man called Aubrey Grandin, an American, won. The key to all of that activity and the smiling hope that he brought was a lamp-lit hour spent on his knees in prayer and Bible study every morning. And there were people who witnessed that and admired it and who've shared that information globally over the years. Wow. Eventually, illness and weakness caused by an undiagnosed brain tumor would overtake him, and he would be hospitalized into the loving hands of people who he had cared for prior to that. On a bitterly, I love this story. On a bitterly cold February day, a composite Salvation Army band would come to play his favourite hymn to the tune of Finlandia. I don't know if you know that hymn, Be Still My Soul. And the final verse is worth reading because it was just hours after that Eric would die. Be still, my soul, the hour is hastening on, when we shall be forever with the Lord, when disappointment, grief, and fear are gone, sorrow forgot, love's purest joys restored. Be still, my soul, when change and tears are past, all safe and blessed, we shall meet at last. On February 21st, 1945, Eric surrendered his life to God for the final time, having embodied the gospel to all that he encountered.
Wow, how powerful. In your description of Eric's life there in the camp, you see a servant leader, someone who is following his Lord. And as you stated, he had his power every morning receiving, just depending upon the Lord's empowerment through prayer, through study, and that exuded, it sounds like, everything he did. And from teaching to taking out the garbage to caring for the people. What a wonderful model of sacrifice, but of humility, but also of someone who led with the truth of Christ. So thank you so much for sharing that. Just a very powerful witness Eric obviously had at that time, and I'm sure under great hardship too, not being having to be away from his wife and children, and at the same time, rather than just being depressed, allowing the Lord to use that opportunity for service. Thank you. That's an amazing story. Thank you so much for just giving us a deeper understanding of Eric's life, his smiling hope that pointed others to Jesus, the ways in which he sacrificially gave and led as a servant leader. So thank you. What a wonderful opportunity to talk with you and learn more about Eric's life. And our hope is that many people will take the time to read his book, Disciplines of the Christian Life, which is a great book that Eric wrote, and as well learn more about his life and how we might, like Eric, seek to follow Jesus and his example in word and deed, and sharing the good news of Jesus with others. So thank you so much, Bob, for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a privilege. Thank you.
Well, now I'm happy to say that Eric Liddell's daughter, Patricia Liddell Russell, has graciously agreed to share some thoughts on her father. Let's see what some of her memories are. Patricia, thank you so much for your willingness to meet with us and reflect upon your father's life and his impact on the world.
It's my pleasure.
Could you tell me, what was life like for you and your family in China before the Japanese invaded in World War II?
I was just a child then, and life in China for us as children and my mother was very pleasant. Um, we lived in the international compound. There was the French division, the Americans, the British, and life was very pleasant. But my father worked outside of the uh, commission. At first, he used to teach science to students, Chinese students, because he felt if the students were educated, then they could bring that back into their country. Then he became a missionary. He became the Reverend. He is now the Reverend Doctor, but he would, uh, and that was he did some very dangerous work. They were out in the countryside, um, and there are a couple of books that explain it really more carefully. There were bandits, there were the Japanese, but not so much then. Um, and they had missions out in the countryside, like in Shaozhong, which was a lovely mission. It had churches and hospitals, and he was away a lot. He was away out in the countryside doing missionary work, and his brother was a doctor out there. Um, but for us as children, it was very pleasant.
How many siblings did you have?
I had two sisters. I was the eldest, Patricia. Heather came a year and a half later, and then Maureen was 6 years later. And I'm sorry to say that both my sisters have departed this world. And I, as the eldest, am still kicking around.
Well, it sounds like growing up in the early years and in China, you had a pleasant life there. Your father was busy going out and doing various mission work, and but you had tell me a little bit about your home life then there in China with your mother and sisters and when your dad was around.
Well, Maureen was born in Toronto, of course. Heather and I were born in China, and they we had an ama that helped look after us, and there was a cook. We had a playground. I know I went to a sort of a nursery school, but I was a very quiet child, and um, yeah, it was pleasant for us. But as you must remember, I was only 6 when we left China. So those years were lovely. At one time, we went home on furlough to Edinburgh, Scotland. I still have a very soft spot for Scotland and Edinburgh. That's to me, that's going home. But we came to Canada um, in June of 1941 because my mother was pregnant with Maureen. It was becoming very dangerous in China at that time because there were the communists on one side, there was the General Chiang Kai-shek on the other, then there was the Japanese. When the Japanese came in, they did not bomb us. They did not want any international interference. But it was terrible for the Chinese. It really was. And I know that um, I my mother, it was very difficult for both my parents because she was expecting Maureen and she didn't want to leave my father, but he said, for the children's sake, go to Toronto, to home, and have the baby, and I will join you when it's possible. Because he worked for the London Missionary Society. And I wonder sometimes if they realized how dangerous it was there. They said, no, it's fine, you stay. So we came back to Canada and we settled in Toronto with my grandparents, my Mackenzie, my mother's parents. And Maureen was born in September of 41. And then there was Pearl Harbor in December of 41. And that whole picture changed. And so he was still in China. Some people got out, but he did not. And so he was under house arrest for a year and a half. And then he was put in a prisoner of war camp in Weishan, which now is called Weifang. Excuse me, Weifang. And so for us, we were safe in Canada.
Were you able to communicate in any way via letters or anything like that during time with your father?
The letters, at first, they were slow, maybe a couple of months in coming. But once the Japanese came in, some of the letters became very sporadic. And some never got through because they were blotted out. I remember a letter came, a Red Cross letter, 25 words, and it was all blacked out. And I remember my mother and grandparents putting it up to the light, trying to see any word, because the Japanese were afraid that maybe there was a code, put in there. So you had to be very careful what you said. So I think of my mother. She was terrific. She was absolutely terrific, and this is what missionaries did. They were separated from their families. And we just waited. We just waited for him.
And it sounds like your father felt that he obviously wanted you all to be in a safe place and was looking out for your welfare.
Absolutely.
And how did you and your mom, support one another as your father was overseas?
Well, for missionaries, it was expected. They were often separated from their families for a long time. My father was separated from his parents for years. And there was a war. We've lived so long without war, but it was wartime. And you did what you had to do. And we were safe, and my father knew we were safe, and we missed him dreadfully. My mother always kept him very alive for us. I mean, we would know that when we woke up in the morning at 7 o'clock, he was getting ready. It was 7 o'clock at night for him. And the moon we saw at night, he was going to see the next night, the same moon. We kept very close to him, and she kept him very alive for us. We just waiting for him to return.
What are some of your memories of your father as a young child?
Well, I remember him as being fun, but he was firm. He was firm because you've probably heard that I was a quiet child. My sister was more lively, but I know my father and I were in a race once, and it was a father and daughter race. You've probably heard this story.
No, I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
Oh, well, anyway, he had to run with a handkerchief, and then he had to give it to me, and then I raced. I was fast, he was fast. So he raced up to me, and I took the handkerchief. No, I had the handkerchief, and I was to hand it to him. So I raced up there, but I wouldn't give it to him. I said, no, this is my handkerchief. I would not give him the handkerchief. So here's this Olympian, and his daughter won't give him the hanky. So of course he didn't win. And he said to me afterwards, and I remember, Trisha he called us. I was called Trisha then. When you work as a team, you work together. You don't do your own thing. You work together as a team. That's the way life is. So I think that really settled. He was.
It might have been the only race you ever lost.
No, he lost a race in camp.
Tell me about that. What happened there?
Well, in the camp, he was becoming ill. He didn't tell anybody, and of course, he was their champion. The children adored him. And there was one young man that said, well, I'm going to have on my record that I beat Eric Liddell. And so my father said, well, we'll do a race. We'll do a race. And of course, it was great entertainment for the camp because they needed entertainment. And of course, he lost, but he wasn't well then. And the young man was so delighted. But when he found out that he was ill, it took away the fun of it.
Sure, but it seems like your dad was always trying to bring cheer and encouragement to those around him, is what it sounds like.
I think in the camp he really he didn't have us as children, so he poured his energy into some of the young people. And years later, years and years when I was grown up, I met some of those children, and I thought, no, we were safe. We were safe. We were warm. We weren't in any. We just missed him terribly. And those children needed him because there were so many children there without their parents. It was tough for them.
Yes, I'm sure. What are some of the lessons do you think we can learn from your father's life and example, and not only with you as a children, but his life in general?
I think I have learned from him, and because a lot of it came through my mother from him. But I think the important things of life are not what you have. It isn't money. It isn't prestige. It's what you can give. What you can give of yourself. What can you make? Can you make things better for the world? Can you bring joy? I sometimes get a little distressed about the me generation. It's me that's important. It's me. And I don't think it is. I think I learned from him that you can get so much more joy out of life by giving.
Oh, that's great. Well, I imagine with the film coming out did open up more interest, and then hopefully now 100 years after his gold medal win and 100 years after his entrance to missionary service, I'm sure hopefully a new generation will be learning about his life and legacy.
I hope so. I hope so.
Yes. Well, Patricia, thank you so much for just sharing your memories of your father, Eric, and just for sharing a little bit of your life with us. We're really grateful for you, and just pray God's blessings on you and in the days to come. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
We now have the pleasure of hearing from John Hoyt, who was mentored by Eric Liddell in the Japanese internment camp during World War II. John, thank you so much for joining us to reflect upon the life of Eric Liddell.
Well, you're welcome. I'm looking forward to sharing. Of course, I was pretty young. I was from 8 to 12 in the camp, but I do have very vivid memories of Eric. We used to call him Uncle Eric Liddell, because he was so involved with us kids. And of course, we were really orphaned. We didn't have parents with us. Most of us had parents inland, and in Free China. My parents were at Lanzhou and Gansu province, so a long way out west, I say. And so Eric was, in a way, an uncle to us. Organized games. He was really involved with children, and that was really remarkable. We remember him very vividly like that. He was also, quite a leader in the camp, very pro-democracy. We tried to form a democracy in a totalitarian state, which was a difficult thing. and he was on the discipline committee, and which was an important committee because it meant that that the campus could discipline people who got into trouble, rather than to let the Japanese discipline them, which could mean that you could be jailed for a long time or actually could be killed. So the discipline committee was a very important democratic way of curtailing violence, and Eric was an important member of that committee.
Wow. Well, what were the circumstances that led to you ending up in this internment camp?
Well, we were in the boarding school at Chifu on the Shantung coast, a lovely spot that Hudson Taylor had chosen it because of its climate and its beauty. And the Chifu schools were very well known for its Christian emphasis, and also academically, we had teachers, masters, teachers who were from Oxford and Cambridge, and very high quality teachers. So we were at Chifu, and I remember very vividly the news that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. And then the Japanese started to march into town. Actually, their cavalry, I remember the horses and the cavalry, and they started by making us wear armbands so we couldn't leave the school compound. Then eventually they said we'd have to stay there. And eventually they shipped us down to Tsingtao. We took the train into Weishan, about 150 miles inland, and we marched up the main road, and there were some prisoners there already, but we realized that this is where we were going to stay to the duration of the war. And we had our teachers with us, so we weren't just orphans, footloose and fancy free, we were under their control, and they tried to teach us with very limited resources, practically no textbooks, very little paper and pencils, but they did keep us trying to get us ready so after the war we would have some sort of very little catch up to do. And we were only about about a year behind in at the end of the war, when we eventually went to England and went to this British school system in England. So the teachers did wonderfully. They were all missionaries. They were all committed to the China Inland Mission. It was a CIM school. That's how we ended up in the camp. And there we were for 3.5 years. Very tough winters, very cold, and we couldn't get much fuel. We were given some coal dust, which is very hard to burn because it's such a powder. So we would make cakes of coke, and had little fireplaces, and every little hut, every little division had its own little fireplace, and piping to pipe out the fumes. So winters were tough, summers were very hot, and of course we couldn't get any cold drinks. All the water had to be boiled because of the dangers of giardia. And so we did have drinking water, but it was always lukewarm. So it was extremes of both cold and warmth. But Eric was a really big factor in our lives as kids. And it's interesting, I've got a number of books written by other friends in the camp. Gordon Martin, who was one of our wonderful favorite teachers, has written a book about the history of the CIM and the school, and he wrote so lovingly about Eric Liddell. But I have 3 other books by friends who were in the camp. And one of the things that was a real shock to us was when he quite suddenly got extreme headaches, and within a few days he had died. So we think it was probably a brain tumor. We're not sure, but it was a huge shock. Not only to us kids, but also to the whole camp, because he was so respected whether you were a Christian or whether you were of any sort of background. There was wonderful Catholic priests. They all knew about Eric and his witness when in the 1924 Olympics, when he won this gold medal. But he was a very modest person. Because he had sent his wife and 2 kids to England, and then they got caught in Canada. He didn't get as far as England because of the war. He was alone, bachelor. And there was one dormitory for all the single men. And my brother, Robin, who was just graduated from high school, he was a member of that dormitory. So when I visited Robin, I saw Eric and his bed among all the other beds, very small space in between them. And he had a painting behind his bed, done by a Chinese friend he had rescued before he'd been sent to the camp. This Chinese friend was dying in a deserted temple in no man's land in the fighting between the Chinese and the Japanese. And he got a friend with a wheelbarrow. They went out and rescued him and went right across the fighting lines to bring him to a hospital and saved his life. Well, this friend was a brilliant painter, and he painted a beautiful picture, which Eric had above his bed. And I thought it was a wonderful symbol of what he had been doing with his life, was to give his talents to other people. A man for all seasons, a man for others. And I remember Robin pointed out the picture, and we did talk to Eric too, and he was very, very amenable to talking to kids. He immediately put us at ease, even though, of course, we thought, wow, this guy is an Olympic runner. It didn't matter at all to him. He was so modest. He liked to almost downplay the Olympic medal, because he didn't want to make that the symbol for who he was. And you could tell it by the way he lived for others and how he cared for his kids.
Wow. Are there any particular interactions with Eric that struck you personally in a deep way as well, and on a personal level, or in conversations?
I remember one particular day he was there repairing a hockey stick. He liked to organize games for us, and we evidently must have brought some field hockey sticks into the camp. I don't know who would have thought of that, but they were all tangled and messed up. So he had some tape and was binding them and trying to repair these hockey sticks so that we could play field hockey. And so we talked to him about that and about his life. I remember very clearly he was telling us that he had 2 daughters, and he couldn't be there. He had sent them ahead, and he was wondering what would have happened if he hadn't sent them ahead. They would be in the camp with us, and there were a number of families there, parents with children, living together in very small, tight quarters. But he had decided to send them on. They would be safer on their way to Scotland. And I do remember talking to him about that. So that, and then meeting him in the dormitory and his friendships. He was very non-judgmental. He didn't, although he was a Christian, he was living in a dorm where there were men of all types, shapes, and sizes, jokes, talking late at night, things like that. But he was very amenable to caring and not causing a fuss, saying, well, I'm a Christian, keep your language clean. He didn't make a fuss about that. So that's one of the things.
Well, it sounds like Eric certainly demonstrated his Christian faith through his service and all? And how else did he kind of demonstrate his Christian faith in the camp?
There were other people there. We had quite an interesting mix, you see, from Roman Catholic priests and monks, some of whom were from monasteries where there was complete silence. So they were. Then we had every different denomination, and there was a church. We had a sort of international church and I still remember we kids were in a dormitory at the top floor of the hospital, and I remember there must have been an Episcopal early morning service down below, and I could still remember the chanting of the Psalms, which the Episcopalians do, coming up towards us as we lay in bed, trying to keep warm. Because, of course, we had no heat in our dormitories, and we didn't have beds. We just had mattresses on the floor. But I remember listening and trying to keep warm and not having to get up into the cold. But if memories like that are very vivid to me.
What was the reaction in the camp after Eric died? Was there a shift in the camp? How did people respond to Eric's passing?
Well, I think he did make a deep imprint on people. I remember his funeral was outside the camp because people were buried outside the camp because there's no room in the camp. There was a mortuary, and I remember as an 11-year-old going in there and finding a beautiful the body of a nun just on this raised dais, and it was quite a shock to meet death face to face. And Eric was buried, and I was part of the honor guard for his very simple funeral or burial. Actually, there was a memorial service in the church, but this burial outside among the Gauliang stalks. This is what the Chinese were growing in those fields, and they would have big mounds of earth where people were buried. But I remember the honor guard, being on the honor guard out there in the middle of winter, and looking back, later on, of course, we saw the wonderful film Chariots of Fire and the memorial service in St. Paul's Cathedral for Abraham's, the other runner, the Jewish runner that was mentioned in the movie. And I remember thinking, what a contrast to Eric's funeral in a very bleak, cold environment outside this prison camp with just a few people as children's honor guard because he loved kids so much, and comparing it with the singing of the hymn and the echoing over the cathedral rafters and the contrast. But who do we remember now? We don't think much about Abraham's, except, of course, he was a good runner and he was at Cambridge. But we think of Eric and his life and what he had done and the memories that we have. And that's why I think it's great that we can celebrate this year in his memory.
How did Eric's life impact your own Christian faith in life?
Well, at that stage, I don't think I had much Christian faith. I was deeply, I suppose not deeply, but I was embittered by the fact that the mission had asked my mom and dad to go to Lanzhou. My dad to be the superintendent of a mission hospital, the Borden Memorial Hospital in Lanzhou, and left us 6 children in the boarding school, just when we really needed mom and dad badly. And looking back, my father could have said, no, I can't leave my kids I'll have to leave the mission field for a time, maybe take them back to England for their education. But in those days, missionaries never questioned the mission board. They did what was needed. And I remember feeling bitter about that. And it was deep down inside me. After the war, we met my dad in Hong Kong. During the war, my mother had died of typhus. And we 6 kids, I think we hoped that it was just a rumor and that it wasn't true. But we were waiting in Hong Kong, hoping to see Mom and Dad. And then we saw my dad there, but no Mom. And we realized it was true that she had died. So there was some big, deep bitterness and difficulties. It wasn't until later that I was able to let the Holy Spirit cleanse that from me. But at that time, I don't think I was that practicing a Christian, though I had gone forward as about a 7-year-old in Chifu to accept Christ. But this time was not a time of easy Christian belief. So that's where I was. But of course, we all go through times. And this was difficult to be separated from parents and separated for so long a time. So Eric made a great deal of difference to us because we knew that somebody did care, and he did. So that made up for that. But I think that all 6 of us kids had a hard time with separation.
It sounds like Eric made obviously a big impact on you and the children in the camp and the people there. Just like you said, many of you were without your parents in a very difficult situation, hardship. So looking back on those years, are there kind of lessons you think or values that Eric espoused or lived out that you think we need to continue to honor and share with others?
Well, I think he was a symbol of what Christ's message, that we don't want fame, that he saw what fame can get to you. When you win a gold medal, people idolize you. There was big celebration when he went back to Scotland after that Olympic work. And he realized that the really important thing was our lives with Christ and our walking with him. And he wrote a very beautiful devotional book of thoughts about that. And it was really something that stuck in my mind, how fame, how promoting yourself gets you into a terrible situation. Christ delivers us from that, and his example of humility, of just being an ordinary, direct friend, that stuck with us after the war. As I've talked to my siblings, we remember him like that. It was very, very moving and something that made a huge impact on our lives. I wrote a memoir. It's called A Persistence of Light. And there's a chapter about the camp and what it meant to us. And the theme of my memoir is that Christ's light persists even in the darkness. And part of the darkness was the prison camp separation from Mom and Dad. And then later on, I described we got involved with Hannibal's crossing of the Alps with his elephants, and we took an elephant across the Alps, and then came from Britain, it came to America, to Silicon Valley. But throughout, my theme was that Christ's persistence of light came through the difficult times. My first wife died of cancer, and that was once again a time of realizing that his persistent light shines through that darkness. And it's a terrible, and I think that Eric's death was like that, was a reminder that our lives can be a shining beacon of light in a dark place. And we certainly needed that in the prison camp.
Yes. Wow. What a wonderful way to really summarize the way Christ works in our lives, has worked in your life, and shown through Eric's life, and can be a light in the darkness. So thank you so much, John. Really appreciate your sharing your story with us. And I do encourage people to check out John's book, and also Eric Liddell's devotional that John mentioned. It's called Disciplines of the Christian Life, that Eric wrote, a wonderful book as well, that'll be on the resource list after following this broadcast. So thank you so much, John. May God bless you in all that you do, and your continued being a light for Christ in this world.
Okay, well, thanks for the opportunity.
Well, we're now going to learn more about this year's celebration of Eric Liddell's launch into missionary service 100 years ago by hearing from John McMillan, the CEO of the Eric Liddell community based in Edinburgh, Scotland. John, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you, and many thanks for your kind invite.
What are some ways as well that the churches are coming on board and celebrating Eric Liddell's faith and commitment to Christ through the Eric Liddell 100 celebrations?
The Eric Liddell community really aims to welcome all religions, Paul, and indeed none. But we are closely linked to Eric, and we very, very clearly respect and celebrate his history and his commitment to Christianity. So what we did, we reached out to the faith community in the UK. Similarly, we took a similar approach to how we developed our educational resources. We brought people of faith together from all denominations, and we said, this is what we're doing. Could you work with us and help us to develop a suitable and appropriate kind of legacy linked to Eric Liddell that celebrates his religious commitments? So we have now developed a range of faith-based resources for all ages, but we've also got a whole range of youth resources that young people can use, and their churches can use to continue to inspire them. But we also reached out to probably one of the most iconic cathedrals in the UK, St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, which if any of your listeners and if you're ever back in Scotland, you need to go and visit St Giles. So I asked them, would you help us to celebrate Eric Liddell? And they said a resounding yes, and they welcomed us to develop this. So we developed a service of celebration and remembrance in the Church of Scotland, so a Christian service. But we wanted to make it a special and meaningful service. So we invited Eric's eldest daughter, Patricia Liddell. She travelled from Canada, and she spoke and delivered the first reading to her father's memorial service. We also invited our patron, who's now the royal patron of the Eric Liddell community, Her Royal Highness, the Princess Royal. So she came up from London and she delivered the second reading at this service. And we had a number of historical links to this service. I would imagine that you'll know that when Eric was held in the Japanese internment camp, when he passed, there was a range of musicians in the internment camp, and including members of the Salvation Army. There was musicians there, and they knew that Eric's favourite hymn was "Be Still My Soul." So as Eric passed literally, they played his favourite tune. So we invited the Salvation Army band to be part of our service at St Giles, and they played the same piece of music. And I've got to say that both our patron and indeed Eric's daughter, I looked at her when they were playing her father's favourite music, and there was a tear in her eye. And we also invited Eric's church, and the moderator of Eric's church. She was part of the service and delivered a really insightful sermon to us. We also we do a lot of work with children and young people at schools. So if you had been with us, a young person, a student would have welcomed you and shook your hand, and they would have passed a crumpled note to you as you walked into St Giles. And on that crumpled note was the message that Eric received from a competitor's coach that just before he won his gold medal. And that crumpled note said, "He who honours me, I will honour." So we tried to reflect some of Eric's history and key messages within that very meaningful and insightful service.
Wow, what a powerful service I'm sure that was. And my understanding is that this June 29th, 2025, there's also another celebration. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is celebrating?
Well, we had an amazing centenary last year, as we've chatted about, and next year is about, we want to continue to keep Eric in everybody's mind, so as people can continue to learn and celebrate his achievements. So next, this summer is the centenary of when he left Scotland and moved to China. To initially, he took up a teaching role, which then led on to him becoming, like his parents, a missionary in China. So this is another great opportunity for us to remember another key element of his life, and hopefully encourage people from around the globe, and particularly in the US, the opportunity and kind invite to join us in remembering Eric, celebrating his life and his achievements.
Well, it's wonderful all that you're doing to celebrate his life, and it's obviously that Eric Liddell honored God, and as a result, the Lord worked in and through his life, both as an Olympic medalist, but also then for the next 20 years as a missionary in China, and just showed his dedication and commitment to Christ and his service to others. So thank you so much for continuing to help people to remember his legacy. I do encourage all of you to go to ericliddell.org. That's the website of the Eric Liddell community. And on that site, there are links to the Eric Liddell 100 celebrations, which includes many of the wonderful resources that John has mentioned here that will help you, give you some tools if you'd like to use with children, with adults, use with churches, schools, to remember and celebrate the legacy of Eric, but maybe more importantly, the values really of his faith in Jesus Christ. So John, we're just so grateful for all that you are doing and for the Eric Liddell community. And just want to wish you God's richest blessings as you continue to serve Edinburgh, Scotland, the United Kingdom, and really the world through your important work. May God bless you, John.
Well, many thanks for your welcome, and great to speak to you. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all of the people who made this broadcast possible, including Bob Rendell, Patricia Little-Russell, John Hoyt, Duncan Hamilton, John McMillan, and also Martin Martin, the U.S. Ambassador for the Eric Liddell 100, and also a C.S. Lewis Institute Fellow who helped connect us with the people involved in this special event. For all of you who have watched this broadcast, I encourage you to explore Eric Liddell's life and faith further through articles, videos, and books, including some which will be listed at the end of this broadcast. Our hope as well is that not only will you learn more about this amazing human being, Eric Liddell, but you'll discover what inspired Eric and enabled him to be a man of passion, compassion, and integrity. That would be Eric's Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, who gave Eric the heart and mind to run, live, and even die in ways that inspire us to this day. As Eric's trainer once said right before his Olympic race, and in the little note he gave to Eric, all crumpled up, he read this. It said, in the old book, it says, "He that honors me, I will honor. Wishing you the best of success always. May we discover the hope and reason for living that Eric found, that in honoring Christ, we can be put in places where we can find greater joy and fulfillment in life. And may we, like Eric as well, demonstrate our joy in life just at the beginning of our day through prayer and scripture reading, and as well then the way we live and speak and live out our lives throughout the day. Thank you for joining us here at the C.S. Lewis Institute. If you enjoyed this broadcast, we encourage you to visit our website at cslewisinstitute.org. May God bless you.